Thanks, everybody. So, following on what Jamie already explained, I mean, the idea for the launch was maybe to give you some sort of summary of experience about what we've learned about perception and some reflections that would be useful to address the challenge of hacking the senses. So, as I was thinking about that, I thought, okay, maybe just sort of putting things in the frame of a series of challenges that I see arise when you try to hack the senses or extend them, and share them with you and see what you make of them. So the first thing that you have to know is that when you talk about hacking the senses, I think we all sort of think about the nice side of the hacking. We think about with the cyborg that Neil Arbison, who has sort of overcome his visual deficit by having crafted this camera which codes colors into sounds and uses this to make portraits of people on different colors that get to them through sounds. We can think also about cochlear implants, which have changed the life of many individuals. We can think about sensory substitution devices. This is the example of a blind climber who manages to climb the wall just using a tactile device. Put on his tongue, which is coding the shape into tactile stimulation that is learned to transfer and to sort of remap in external space so that he can use it to navigate his way through a challenging spatial task. That's the nice side or the bright side of hacking the senses. But maybe what can come to mind also is the dark side of extending the senses. There's a subculture of people like this guy called Tiger Man, who actually are fascinated by the idea of having animal-like senses and are modifying their bodies in order to sort of shape them in a way that will make their sensations resemble more the sensations of their favorite animals. And maybe for some people it will be on the bright side, but you can see that it's just starting to be on the darker side. You can think also about lots and lots of science fiction cases where using sensory extensions or having robots with sensory extensions actually turn out to be almost like torture, and having too much experience is also, I think, a risk if you hack the senses. Maybe we have evolved to have certain level of stimulation, and just having more might be a challenge. But you also have to remember that the idea of hacking or extending the senses has also first been sort of developed by the military. And a lot of the research on the initial sensory substitution, like the tongue display unit used by this blind climber, is actually used to improve night vision of soldiers in the battlefield. Right? So there's a nice sort of reminder here that when we decide to hack the senses, there are the nice aspects and the bad aspects. And maybe we need also then to remember in the middle of this bright and dark side the trivial aspects of hacking the senses. Something as simple as braille reading or navigating your way around a room with a stick are a way in which we've learned to extend our senses. In the case of the walking stick, by just using a natural phenomenon that we sort of transfer the tactile sensations through tools, then you could sort of feel the texture of the ground as if you were touching it, although you're using a tool that you're holding. In the case of Braille, it's obviously a case where you've sort of hacked the senses in a way. You've hacked your sense of touch in order to get at words and reading. But if you think about it, hacking the senses and sort of rewiring them in one way is almost trivially done on our everyday basis with reading, even non-braille reading. Language has not evolved to be written or read, it has evolved to be spoken and heard. And you have words encoded in phonological units, and they were not meant to be transferred or translated into visual items. So it's a whole cultural institution that has managed to sort of map sounds into visual shapes. And now we use visual shapes that we decode again as sounds, and we can have transfer of ideas. That's the case of hacking, if you want, vision to serve language, but we didn't evolve to do that. So there are many things from the sublime to the terrifying with the trivial in the middle that you can do if you decide to hack the senses. But maybe once you have all these cases and you hear about so many cases, or you will read about many cases, the question is whether they all align with one another, whether we should all think about them just as cases of hacking, or whether we could sort of build subcategories and think about different challenges being raised by different categories of cases. So that's what I thought was specifically useful to think about. There are cases where we can hack the senses to augment them, and they will be different from cases where you will sort of try and acquire new senses. But there are cases also of sensory transfer, which I want to distinguish from sensory translations. And I think these four cases are very different. They're not exactly put in the order of the less challenging to the more challenging, but still, as you will see, there's a kind of gradient of difficulties and challenges that arise as we go through these cases. Sensory augmentation could be thought about, and I thought the kind of intuitive idea to think about it is like our senses have a definite power. So the power is defined by many biological constraints. So you could think about the number of sensory receptors you have. You could think about their bandwidth, what they respond to. So for instance, the eye doesn't respond to ultraviolet or infrared. Their sensitivity, at which level of stimulation you will start to have your receptors transferring the signal. You could think about also about the way they're implemented on the human body. So we don't have eyes at the back of our heads. So one very easy way you can hack the senses is sort of manage to do something with the camera where you will certainly have a visual experience of your back all day long. That would be a way of augmenting the power of human vision by just changing the location or managing to twist or play with the location. One thing you need also to think about is that I think we need not to think about receptors as a series of sort of individuals just sort of transferring information, but receptors also collaborate with one another. That's especially true, for instance, in touch, where when you touch a part of the skin, even with a small needle, then all the other receptors will be also sending the information that there's a mechanical stimulation being received. You can think about olfaction also. It's not olfaction is not given to you by just one olfactory receptor being stimulated, but they need to collaborate. And as they collaborate, they also sometimes interfere with one another. The most beautiful case of collaboration or interference you can think about, which is not that well known, is the case of photic sneeze, which was actually discussed initially by Aristotle when he noticed that many people start sneezing when they go in the bright daylight. It's a condition which is also known as the helio-ophthalmic syndrome, and apparently about 20 to 30% of the population get that. It's especially true if you spend some time in the dark and you go in the bright light. It's especially dangerous if you're a pilot, because you start sneezing when you go up in the air. So it has been studied actually quite extensively, and what seems to be the most likely explanation, although we still lack the ultimate evidence, is that as the bright stimulates your retina, it sort of also triggers, it stimulates the cranial nerve, which starts the sneezing reflex. So the proximity between sensory receptors can also create patterns of interference. All that is a huge constraint. It's a well-built system. So our receptors are distributed in a way and function together in a way which needs to be taken into account. So you could think about hacking the senses by a way of sort of trying to augment any of these parameters, augment the number of receptors, augment, as I said, the surface in which they are distributed, or sort of play with their level of collaboration or interference, change their threshold, and so on and so forth. So that's a big challenge. But I think the challenge here, if we want to take seriously the Hack the Senses program, is to avoid deferring all of this augmentation to sensory to the technology. If there is, deferring to the machine is not the same thing as hacking the senses. So again, if you think about night vision and these devices which have been developed for the army and are now widely available, everything is done at the level of the machine, right? I mean, it's very simple. I won't go through the display where basically you have very little photons sort of hitting the first plate, and then they're just amplified by the second, and then transferred into a green luminescent image, which will give you more information about the environment outside. Here, everything is done by the machine. Is it hacking the senses in an interesting sense? I don't think so. Now, there are always ways, and that's a very nice one, which I don't think you should propose to the Wellcome Trust. But here's the beautiful thing: we know that cannabinoids will actually change night vision. It has been shown that it improves night vision. It's an old traditional habit by Moroccan fishermen to smoke kiff because before going fishing, and indeed it improves this. And what we know is that there are cannabinoids, actually, then we have a good idea of the mechanism. There are cannabinoid receptors in the human retina. The good news is that you don't need cannabinoid receptors respond to endocannabinoids, so you don't need to have the external input, so maybe that's okay for the Wellcome. But you could think about sort of improving night vision by just boosting these cannabinoid receptors or the endocannabinoid which trigger them. So there are ways in which here we won't defer the power of augmenting the senses to technologies, but do something which has to do with the human biology of the receptors themselves. And that's the big challenge, not defer to technology too much. The thing you could do also, and that's an experiment that has been done by a lab of people, is to just think of copying or extending the actual senses, and in this case, the text missing, but I will walk through that. The idea was to see whether we could sort of use the actual mechanoreceptors that humans have to have something which is close to the whiskers of the rat. And this group actually did sort of equip humans with this long, semi-rigid whisker-like thing that then would sort of transfer force through the actual tactile receptors they had on their fingers. So they were actually equipped with whisker-like extensions of their fingers. And it's a beautiful picture because basically every time you read, the humans actually did as well as the rats. And even sometimes better. They outperform the rats in identifying shapes with these new whiskers, and they did as well in a sort of spatial navigation task. But what was really interesting here in this paper is that the biomechanics of the receptors and the whiskers of the rats and the one of the humans are very different. But it turns out that some of the strategies that the two species adopted were pretty similar. So the idea was also that the humans did very well when they had a few whiskers, but if you gave them too many, then they started to be doing less well than the rats. So here you can do quite a lot in terms of sort of crafting some new extending the receptors or using them. But you have also to remember that we might not just be able to push the limits as much as we hope we could. So that's the case for sensory, what I call sensory augmentation, which is really looking at the receptor levels, and maybe just remember the cannabinoid receptors in the retina as one good example. Another case will be a case where you just try and provide people with totally new senses, and the idea is then to give access to properties or features or kinds of objects or scales that people never had access to. And if you want to take that seriously, then it means that you should be able to acquire new kinds of sensor or receptors. Here you will have to defer quite a bit of technology. You could craft people, for instance, with sensors which respond to magnetic waves, or you could try and do a variety of things to sort of give people new senses. The challenge is, where do you craft them, right? Because these are not the sensors that are already there you need to sort of put them in the system so that they function and they are treated, as Jamie was saying. They're not just sending signal. The signal needs to be meaningful for the brain and lead to a perception. So here the challenge would be to say, well, we didn't evolve with these sensors. Can we actually bypass evolution? If you look at the evolution of any sensory organ, there is a long history explaining exactly why our sensors or our receptive surfaces are shaped in the way they are. They're very different from others. So the idea that you could just do anything with the eye and just sort of go back to, say, have the same visual experience as a bee, for instance, or insect vision, would be really, really challenging. But we have good cases where this can be done, and this can only be sort of taken as a case of real sensory acquisition in the case of congenitally blind subjects. So you can think about congenitally blind subjects as people who have to totally miss the sense of vision, but through some devices like here, the tongue display unit, which is this tactile matrix giving a tactile stimulation on the tongue, which translates a image filmed by a camera. There is a way in which the blind can sort of acquire a sort of pseudo-visual sense, in the sense that it gives them a reasonable level of performance in tasks that are usually associated to the possession of vision. They can navigate their way through space just using this device. But interestingly, and that's the main argument for the argument that there is an acquisition, what you find here is that they start sort of activating part of the occipital cortex, which is the part of the brain which is usually activated by visual input when they actually receive tactile stimulation through this device after learning. And this is only true of blind individuals. So you could think that there is a way in which the normal visual areas of the brain, which haven't been recruited to process visual inputs in the case of blind subjects, get activated in a more kind of consistent way with the use of these devices. That's a third case then is the case of sensory transfer. And here we need to shift and think about the same devices being used by non-blind subjects. And I think that's one problem sometimes in the sensory substitution literature, is that because we test things both with blind and early blind and congenitally blind people, we think that these cases are analogous. But the congenitally blind subjects will just acquire everything, whereas your sighted subjects, or the people who had vision initially, will still have memories, visual memories, or things to contextualize this new information with. And in this case, they just sort of have learned something in vision, and you ask them to use that through a new set of devices. So the case of sensory transfer here are cases where you could think that you have been equipped with two senses, which somewhat give you access to the same kind of information. Space is a good example, so you get access through spatial properties of objects, for instance shape, both through vision and touch, and they work together in many cases to give you a more reliable access to shape information. But we could think about blindfolding you and sort of giving you tactile information of the tongue for distant objects which are filmed, and then you will sort of recover the capacity to perceive the shape of distant objects through touch. So that's a way in which you already had access to distant objects through vision, but you switch it off and you use another sense to give you access to the same information. That's why I'm thinking about these cases as cases of transfer. Here the big challenge is that if you want again to take seriously the idea that you have hacked the sense of touch to perceive distant shapes, you need to make sure that people don't just use their old visual habits. So if everything can be explained by people sort of painfully retransferring and redrawing sort of visually the image that is drawn on their tongue and sort of drawing a visual image and then sort of using that to navigate, again, that's interesting, but first it will take a lot of time, and second, that might not be the cases of hacking the senses that we are after. So the question here is that if you do that, if you ask people to sort of change their sensory habits, then you have to tell them how to switch off their old habits. I think using sensory deprivation text is a very good idea. not everybody will agree here. Yes. And I want to try to contrast these cases, again, which are sometimes run together in the literature of sensory transfer with what I call sensory translation, where here it's not that your two senses, the two senses you're thinking about, give you access to the same object or property. You had one very specific sense giving you access to one property, and you need to sort of make that property available to a sense which had no access to it at all. So here you could think, although it's not absolutely true that we don't hear the shape of objects, I mean, there's a minimal sense in which you get a bit of spatial information about whether some objects, for instance, are small or big from the sounds they emit when they're struck, but we can't really say that the sense of audition is tuned to perceive the shape of objects. There is another generation of sensory devices which consist in transferring the visual image, which is scanned by the camera, into a soundscape or a pattern of sounds, which then sort of can code for visual features like the elevation or the position from the left to right. And from that sort of sounds, you can recover information about the shapes of objects. That's making shape available to a sense which had no access to shape. That's the case of sensory translation. Now, that's another case of sensory translation here, which is well illustrated. This is getting access to color through these sounds. So you could put not only sort of information about the shape of objects, but you could get information about color. And this is a blind person, being asked to pick up the red apple in the tray of green apples. Obviously, from the sounds, you can recover that information. So these devices work, but here you have a big challenge, which is to think about the right way to operate for this translation. It's not that anything goes. And there's a way in which you could think, okay, maybe I could use sounds to translate smells. Okay. But if everything has to go via a long and painful learning, when you have to hear these sounds and remember all the time that this is coding for this smell, then this is also not really hacking the senses. This is using your memory and the high-level cognitive functions to make you perform a sensory task. And it's not really specific. So, for instance, one beautiful idea of the devices I presented was to use a natural mapping that Jamie also mentioned, the kind of correspondences between the senses, to code elevation with pitch. Because we all think about high pitch as being high in space and low pitch as being lower in space. There is abundant experimental literature showing that we actually have biases toward high pitch sounds being located higher in space. So that's a brilliant idea that worked very well for sighted subjects. But the thing that we showed is that actually when you try and see whether this cross-modal mapping exists everywhere universally, or whether they exist for people who never have had vision, then you might find that they're not as intuitive as we thought. So be careful here, and the challenge here will be to sort of choose the right way to translate one sensory modality into another. Not every way of translating, even if it looks very intuitive to you, you could think, of course, salty music would be staccato. But before you test your idea and make sure that this is the right translation, then people might not get it. Whenever we have people from design or marketing coming with brilliant ideas in our lab to discuss that, that's the right way to convey sweetness, is to use blue. No. That's the color of, I was talking to people with the cornetto, and the packaging of cornetto is blue. But it's not putting anything about sweetness. That's not, and they thought it was a brilliant way of coding their vanilla ice cream. So be careful when you choose these translations and really test them, not only with people around, but maybe in a more scientific way. Challenge your intuitive way of thinking about these translations. So, just to wrap up, and before I go on toward the conclusion, I think we have 4 challenges here for hacking the senses: augmenting, acquiring, transferring, and translating. And they come with different sets of challenges. It's just a wrap up of things things I've already said. These are specific challenges, but I wanted to conclude with having worked on sensory substitution and cross-modal mapping for several years now, and where I think the frontiers really lie, even if we manage to augment, acquire, and transfer sensory information. And the first thing is that these devices, or this way of extending the senses, are incredibly powerful when we look at features level. So you can make people sort of grasp information about color through sounds. You can make them grasp information about shapes, but putting shape and color together in this auditory device is incredibly difficult. So once you stop looking at feature by feature or task by task, and looking at something which resembles a sense, that is something you carry along and performs many tasks, gives you access to full objects or even scenes, then the hacking of the senses becomes incredibly challenging. And I don't think that we have managed to perform very well here in terms of object or even objects in relation to one another. That's really a new frontier. I think that's very, very difficult to address today. But there is a second challenge that we need to think about, is that the sensory experiences we have on an everyday basis, they're not cold. They come with not only connections to memories and expectations, but also evaluations, hedonic value, pleasures and displeasures. And one thing that these extensions tend to do is that they give you access to cold information, but they don't sort of give you, they don't connect your evaluative system. So I just wanted to finish by showing you a good example of how this challenge might be addressed. And the example comes from a beautiful short movie which was made on a late blind man who started to lose his vision when he was in his mid-30s, and decided to write about his experience. And it's called John Hull. And in this extract, he shows that what he has lost by losing his vision is not just access to the faces of his wife or the faces of his children, but it's all this kind of direct emotional connection to the world.
September the 9th, 1983, on the experience of hearing rain falling. This evening, I came out of the house at 9 o'clock, and it was raining. I stood for a few minutes, lost in the beauty of it. Rain brings out the contours of what's around you, in that it introduces a continuous blanket of differentiated and specialised sound, uninterrupted, which fills the whole of the audible environment. If only there could be something equivalent to rain falling inside, then the whole of a room would take on shape and dimension. I should also say that this is an experience of beauty. Instead of being isolated, cut off, preoccupied internally, you are presented with a world. You are related to a world. You are addressed by a world.
So just to stop, I think that's the perfect illustration of the two challenges. I mean, one is that unless the hacking of the senses just present you with, as the narrator says, with a world of objects, where you feel addressed by objects and you're not just sort of using these new senses to perform tasks. We're not sort of performance related, but you have this feeling of presence of objects, for instance. Then you won't have the possibility to connect them to anything evaluative and the kind of beautiful experience that this person describes. If anybody can take up the challenge of managing a device which will just fill up the room with artificial rain sounds, that might do it for hacking the senses and